Robert Moxley is an attorney licensed to practice in the state of Wyoming with offices in Cheyenne, Wyoming. He's a 27-year member of the Bar of the United States Court of Federal Claims. Mr. Moxley has been admitted to practice in the federal courts of Wyoming and Nebraska and has been a member of the bars of the 5th, 8th, 10th, and Federal Circuit Court of Appeal, as well as the United States Supreme Court. Mr. Moxley has appeared to present argument as lead counsel in all those federal appellate courts. Mr. Moxley graduated from the University of Oklahoma College of Law in 1978 and has been in private practice in the state of Wyoming for 37 years. He began many years of practice under the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Compensation Act when the vaccine court opened in 1989 and has represented well over 100 vaccine-injured persons. Mr. Moxley has been lead counsel in dozens of vaccine court appeals to the Federal Circuit and appeared as petitioner's counsel in the only 2 vaccine program cases to be reviewed by the United States Supreme Court. Mr. Moxley has defended the right of religious exemption to vaccinate in the state and federal courts since 1990. And he continues to pursue civil rights litigation on behalf of California residents and their children who are deprived of their rights to object to state-mandated vaccination under California Senate Bill 277. Do we have a rock star or what? Come on up here, Dr.
I appreciate that introduction, and I have sang some rock and roll in my day. I have a riddle for you. You know why when heavy equipment backs up it goes beep, 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 beep? No. Plaintiff's lawyers. And that's what's wrong with the vaccine injury picture, because they took the plaintiff's lawyers out of it. In 1986, when I was first getting involved in this, we had DPT injuries in the office, and my older partner was one of the old bulls in products liability. He had won Jeep rollover cases and things like that, and we were fixing to sue Letterly and Wyeth and those people, and we had colleagues in Wichita, Kansas, actually, who were getting multi-million-dollar verdicts against the DPT manufacturers for the dirty product that they were selling. And you know, you hear this pronouncement that the Supreme Court supposedly made about vaccines being unavoidably unsafe. That's not exactly what they said. What they said was that the common law rubric for suing people who produce defective products is that if you can show that it was avoidably unsafe, then they should have avoided it. And all of this goes on to all of this is on the vaccine manufacturers for making an unsafe product. And it's all on Congress for giving them immunity that causes us to have all of these vaccines. What I've told people about this in my country way is if you had a widget factory and if you could get the government to pass a law saying every man jack in America had to buy 3 or 4 of your widgets, pretty soon you'd be really respectable. And that's what has happened to us. Now, when I got into this vaccine practice, I thought that the Vaccine Act was the greatest thing ever. Of course, the part of the Vaccine Act that I was looking at was the Compensation Act, and the Vaccine Act was 2 things. It was the Compensation Act and it was the vaccine program. Now, the vaccine program, as such, is an enormous federal corrupt bureaucracy that exists for no reason but to promote more and more and more vaccines and make Big Pharma more and more and more money. And they are the opponent of injured children in the childhood vaccine court, so-called court. It's not actually a court. Back when it was passed, the act said that you could file an action down the street in your own federal court, and that your own federal judge would appoint a special master to review the medical records. And there was a table of injuries. And when Barbara Loe Fisher and all of her wonderful lobbyists and all of her wonderful advocate allies got the act passed, there was a thing called the vaccine injury table. And the vaccine injury table was like a grid. And if you fit into this grid, you had a vaccine injury. If your child had an encephalopathy, within 3 days of a DPT vaccine, within 7 days of an MMR vaccine, you had a vaccine injury. And the whole idea was that a special master would be appointed. In the federal courts, there's a rule about special masters. And the rule about special masters is that special masters are appointed with the consent of the parties, and that they serve as an adjunct to the court, and that they recommend to the court what should be done. And so what would have happened back in those days, if the act had not been immediately subverted, when you could have gone to your local federal district court, your federal district judge who would have known all of the sharp malpractice attorneys and all the guys who knew a lot about medicine in the bar that appeared in front of that court, and some guy who is smart and fair and known to everybody would have been appointed to look at the medical records, and if your child's medical condition fit into this vaccine injury table, and there was a list of all of the injuries that everybody knew the vaccines caused, and you'd get compensation, and it'd be actual compensation. It'd be all of the expenses that your injured child was going to have, or your injured adult was going to have for the rest of their lives. And it was too good to be true. And by the time we even started filing actions down the street in that big tall red building that was across from the White House this morning where the protest was, when we started filing actions there, by that time it wasn't in your federal courts anymore. And soon after that, the vaccine injury table was gone, because the Department of Justice and the Secretary of Health and Human Services were opponents of the act. They were only in favor of the act because they were friends of Big Pharma. So, I'm sorry to give you like a State of the Union and tell you that the union is really screwed up. Because in 1995, the vaccine injury table went away, and everybody who has vaccine injury is now required to prove actual causation, and they're required to bring their treating physician in and put their treating physician under a microscope to see if the medical records are right about what they say about what happened to the kid. And of course, the treating physicians are all brainwashed, as it were. They all are adherents to an orthodoxy, and the orthodoxy is there's no such thing as a vaccine injury. And in fact, the Vaccine Injury Compensation Act court, so-called court, the Office of Special Masters, is a forum that is designed for the government's agenda to prove that there is no such thing as a vaccine injury. Very well. What do we do about that? I think that this Vaccine Safety Commission is one of the most essential steps that can be taken. Other than that, the only thing that's going to save this country is slow education of all of the medical profession by these brave people who we've been hearing from in the last hour. Until the doctors know what they are doing to your children and what they're doing to you, it's not going to stop. Now, the Vaccine Act is a secret. Nobody knows about it. In fact, nobody knew about it when I started practicing in the Vaccine Act until my partner and I wrote an article for Exceptional Parent magazine, and my colleagues have told me that more than half of the cases that were filed in the program in the beginning were filed because of the Exceptional Parent article, because the Secretary of Health and Human Services was keeping the whole thing a secret. They don't publicize it now. As you heard earlier, nobody has any access to the vaccine safety data link that has all of the information about vaccines and all the information about vaccine injuries. The data is not there. They refuse to do the kind of studies that are necessary to compare unvaccinated to vaccinated populations. They have refused to do the safety studies that were identified at the time of the so-called IOM reports. I mean, there's a veneer of scientific respectability to this vaccine program. It's false, but it's convincing, because they had the national institutes, the IOM, do a bunch of reports about vaccines where they were supposed to study causality between all of the vaccines and all of the conditions that people were alleging that vaccines actually caused. They came up with all kinds of questions where they said, these questions are still to be answered. And this was done in 1991, it was done in 1995, it was done several times, and at the end of every one of those IOM reports, there's a bunch of commentary about these are the questions that still need to be answered. These questions have not been answered. And the vaccine, I call it the vaccine industrial complex. The vaccine industrial complex has hundreds of vaccines in the pipeline ready to sell to you. And I don't care if you buy them, but they shouldn't make you buy them. And so, meanwhile, the whole sinister effect of the whitewash of vaccine injuries, I should tell you this. One of my colleagues did some research about how difficult it is to find a vaccine attorney, and it is almost 5 times as easy to find an animal rights attorney as it is to find a vaccine attorney. If you look at Martindale Hubble, which is the great directory of lawyers that lists every lawyer in the country and what kind of practice they have, there's 5 times as many animal rights as there are vaccine attorneys. So, I mean, if you know somebody whose child has suffered a vaccine injury, you should tell them about the act, and if it looks like a vaccine injury, you should tell them about the act pretty fast, because the statute of limitations is only 3 years. Some of these conditions are not even definable 3 years after onset. But if you don't litigate like crazy with the government, you have no safety net for vaccine injury. And the lack of a safety net for vaccine injury is absolutely a sin. And yet, I was out in California testifying about the SB 277, and there were doctors, proponents of that act, that were telling their doctors who were senators, elected by Big Pharma, I suppose, doctors who were senators who were telling people that the most dangerous thing in vaccines is water. They were telling their colleagues that there is no such thing as a vaccine injury. They say, we don't use that term. So all I can urge is eternal vigilance. We are going back to California this summer, and we're going to sue. We're going to sue in federal court to set aside SB 277, and we think that we have to. It's a dangerous. Thank you. It's a dangerous opportunity, because this is the beachhead. This is where we have to throw them back into the ocean, or it's going to come to your state. There have been 34, I think, little SB 277s at least talked about in 34 different states, where they want to say that you can't say no to vaccines. One of these senators that was commenting when I was testifying before a committee back there said, we're not going far enough. We need to mandate adult vaccines too. Now, I have spent a considerable amount of my career in defending people's religious exemptions. And let me tell you that don't let anybody in the states that you're in, if you're having a hard time avoiding vaccinations, don't let any bureaucrat tell you that you don't that you're not entitled to a religious exemption because your clergyman doesn't agree with you about vaccines. I mean, we are talking about freedom of conscience. The freedom of conscience is in your conscience, you can't hurt your own kid. You refuse to hurt your own kid. If you pray about that, and if you feel good about your decision because God has led you to your decision, you're entitled to a religious exemption to those vaccines. And so, all I can say is what my old daddy used to say when somebody was having a hard time: keep punching. Thank you.